Okay, so to continue with this discussion of the Constitution, we talked about the grants of power you find in Article 1, the legislative branch. So let's turn to Article 2, the executive branch, and just take a look at what this language sounds like that gives the president the powers that we recognize him as having. The first power is the power as commander-in-chief, and it doesn't say very much here, you'll see, and that's followed by the treaty power and the power to appoint members of the government and ambassadors and justices. And in Section 3, you'll see the power powers to convene the Congress and essentially be the foreign policy chief. And finally, this phrase here, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This is the phrase in the Constitution that gives the president the authority to kind of sit atop the federal executive branch, the bureaucracy, and implement the laws. Now, Section 2 of Article 3 is where you'll find discussion of judicial power, and I'm not going to talk about that very much, but it explains the different kinds of cases that the Supreme Court has authority over. Now, one might consider as well that the income tax power that is set up with Amendment 16 is an extension of the power, the taxation power that we find in Article 1, Section 8. So these are just just some of the examples. Let's look at the denials of power then. Where do we find places in the Constitution where it says, you cannot do this? We see that in Section 10 of Article 1. No state shall, I'm talking first about the legislative branch at the federal level. That's in Section 9. The first phrase here is in italicized because it's not relevant anymore. This was the prohibition on the Congress couldn't outlaw the slave trade until 1808, and you can see that this is what this is talking about. But you might read it and never know that it was talking about slavery or slaves or the slave trade because of the very obfuscating language that it's using, the migration or importation of such persons. Those are the slaves. Okay, so here's the one of the most important things in this section. The writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, meaning that Congress cannot hold people without a charge. We'll talk about this more when we talk about civil liberties. And some other things that are important here, there's no tax or duty on exported articles. So the Congress does not have the power to tax exports. They can tax imports, but not exports. Can't pass laws against things that happened in the past. That's what ex post facto law means. So these are the denials of power. And we also see denials of power in Section 10 here. This is dealing with the states. No state shall, for instance. They also cannot tax exports, but they also can't tax imports. Only the federal government can do that, unless they're specifically paying for port facilities. They also can't keep troops without some consent of Congress and things like that. So you'll see that in that section. It always seemed to me like Section 10 of Article 1 should really be in Article 4, because this is about the states. It was always confusing to me. Why is that in Article 1? But anyway. We also understand that, for instance, the 27th Amendment about the pay raise tells Congress that they can't raise their own pay until an intervening election has taken place. You might also think of the very difficult amendment process as a denial of power. Essentially, it makes it very difficult to amend the Constitution. It requires 2/3 of the House and the Senate. It's a very difficult paragraph to read. I'll take you to it. But anyway, here's the paragraph about amending the Constitution. 2/3 of both the House and the Senate and 3/4 of the states have to agree to an amendment. It does not mention the president anywhere, so the president doesn't have any role in this process. But that's a very high bar, and it's rarely achieved. In fact, it's only been achieved really, 17 times. The Bill of Rights being all at once, and then 16 other amendments, or 17 other amendments, so 18 times. All right, so let's talk about the separation of powers. Now, the idea here was to divide power between the different branches so that no one of them would have every bit of any particular power. And it was based on an idea that was discussed a lot in the 18th century with a book that was published around that time in the late 18th century, called The Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu. And he talked about when one considers governing in a very abstract sense, there are three kinds of powers. There's the power to write the law, there's the power to implement the law, and the power to interpret the law. And this was what was kind of guiding the people that wrote the Constitution in their dividing these three kind of abstract powers up into these three branches, but also making sure that all of the branches had some say over each of those powers. So it's clear that the legislative branch in Article 1, they have the law-making power, right? This is Article 1, Section 7. This is the process for writing a law. But the president has the veto power. So they gave the president some ability to have some say over that process. So they didn't want to give the people in the legislative branch ultimate authority over that. They divided it. We also see an example of checks and balances in the fact that in Article 1 in Section 2 and 3, up here, that's where we see the impeachment process spelled out. The House and the Senate each have a role. The House draws up an impeachment, and the Senate then, so they have the sole power of impeachment. The Senate then kind of holds a trial to decide whether to remove somebody after an impeachment. So it's a two-step process. And this obviously gives then the legislative branch some say over what the president is doing and the ultimate ability to remove the president and other officers as well in the judicial branch. We might also think of the fact that presidential appointments, the treaty power, all of these things require Senate approval, and that's spelled out in Article 2 in Section 3, where the president's power to do those things is spelled out. The president has the power to appoint, that should say Section 2, sorry. The president has the ability to appoint with the advice and consent of the Senate, right? Very important. And 2/3 of the Senate must agree to treaties. And up here as well, the nomination with the Senate approval, and those don't specify 2/3; those are 50% of the Senate for these kinds of nominations. So that's another example. So that's where the language is for that. You again might think of the amendment process as an example of separation of power. It requires the legislative branch and the states. And, also in Article 1, Section 9, an important one that's worth pointing out, Article 1, Section 9 is the, things that they can't do, right? And it says that no money can be drawn from the Treasury except by appropriations made by the regular lawmaking process. So every bit of money they spend has to go through the regular lawmaking process. That includes the legislative branch, House and the Senate, and also the President has veto power over that. So these are some examples of checks and balances. There are others. Now, I just want to continue with these other elements in the system. Federalism first. Where do we find the parts of the Constitution that spell out how the federal system is going to work? Well, what we mean by federalism, and I'll talk about this more next time, is that the Constitution does anticipate that both the federal government and the states are going to have power. There's going to be a balance of power between the two. And this was really a really extraordinary arrangement. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. And we're still trying to figure out what does that mean and how does that work, this sharing of power. And I'll spend some time talking about that next time. But very crucial for that, I've mentioned already the Commerce Clause that gives the federal government the right, the ability, and the power to regulate commerce among the states. And the Necessary and Proper Clause that extends the powers of the federal government to things that are not specifically on the list, right? So those are crucial in the way that we've come to understand the relationship between the federal government and the states over time. Article 4, I've mentioned already, state and federal relations, and Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, the Constitution and all laws which are made in pursuance thereof are the supreme law of the land. Now, that does not mean that federal law is always supreme over state law. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that if the federal government's doing something that they're allowed to under the Constitution, that is the supreme law. And there are, so many ways in which this is still very unclear what this means in our governing system, and I'll talk about that next time as well. And of course, the 10th Amendment. Let me just take you to that so we can look at that language real fast. The 10th Amendment says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the people, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Now, the meaning or how this works in our system has changed over time, and I'll discuss that next section as well. The Constitution also talks about elections and how elections are going to take place, who's in charge of elections, who gets to vote. So for instance, in Article 1, the way that they set it up generally is that for each of these sections, you'll see the election stuff comes first. So in Article 1, Section 2, that's a discussion of the House of Representatives. And the very first paragraph here, the very first two paragraphs, I should say, discuss the qualifications for office. And the same thing with the Senate. You'll find that in Section 3 of the Senate. We also had an important change at the 17th Amendment that shifted the election of senators from being chosen by the state legislators to being directly elected by the people like they are today. That was Senate Amendment 17. The president is, and the president's election and succession are the most common discussion in or issue in all of the amendments. The process itself of electing the president is spelled out here in Article 2 at the beginning, right? This is the Electoral College, essentially. The qualifications of the president and the Electoral College. Now, all of this is italicized because we changed how the Electoral College works in the 12th Amendment. This original language just didn't work. It was actually incorrect and flawed, and so we changed with the 12th Amendment, fixing the Electoral College. And I'll talk about the Electoral College and how it works later. We also addressed the inauguration and succession of the president in the 20th Amendment, put a term limit on in the 22nd, gave Electoral College votes to District of Columbia in the 23rd Amendment, and again talked about the succession in the 25th Amendment. So we have had a hard time figuring out what the process should be around the president and his election and succession of office if things happen. As far as who votes and the right to vote, those are addressed in the 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments. And I'll discuss just quickly, this is after the Civil War, giving former male slaves the right to vote. This is women, this is getting rid of the poll tax, and this is 18-year-olds. Right? So those are elections in the Constitution. Now we're addressing something that's not actually in the Constitution, but a very important part of the system, and that is judicial review. Now, what that means is that the Supreme Court has the power to strike down laws that it considers are in conflict with the Constitution. They did not address this specifically in the Constitution itself, what would happen if Congress passed a law that was unconstitutional. In a Supreme Court case in 1803, the Supreme Court sort of gave itself the power to strike down those laws. And since then, that has been an important part of our system. Two last parts, individual rights and liberties and equality. Now, individual rights and liberties, those are addressed in the Bill of Rights 1 through 9. 1 through 9 are individuals, and the 10th Amendment, the citizens of states. Now, I'll just talk about those just very briefly. The First Amendment, speech, religion, assembly, and press. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Third, quartering soldiers. And then the 4th through the 8th Amendments are the rights of the accused in various forms and fashion. And we'll talk about these when we talk about civil liberties. 9th Amendment's kind of unusual. Let me just flip over to that real fast. The 9th Amendment says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Now, this was put into the Constitution to make Madison happy. Madison had not wanted a specific bill of a list of rights to be put in the Constitution because he thought that that would limit people's ability, future generations, to decide other rights that they might have that the original people had forgotten. He said, certainly courts would look at that list and say those are the only rights that you have. So the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, what they mean there is these, 1 through 8. That's what they mean. This list of rights, enumeration means list. Shall not be construed, that means shall not be understood. So this list of rights that we just gave you shouldn't be understood to deny that there might be others retained by the people as well. Now, in the time since that Bill of Rights was put in, the Supreme Court has only ever used the Ninth Amendment to extend that list of rights to one other right, and that's the right of privacy, the bodily privacy that gives one the right to information about birth control, to abortion, and to gay sex. Those are the only, the right to privacy, that bodily privacy is the only right that the court has recognized outside the list that's up here. So this is a very powerful issue that still is being debated today. We also want to mention under this section of individual rights, the habeas corpus section in Article 1, Section 9. That's the prohibition, the things that the denials of power, and we will talk about that a little bit more later as well. Finally, equality. Now, the idea of equality is an important part of our constitutional system today. It was not originally. In 1787, no one was thinking about equality. It wasn't an important issue. It was added to the Constitution in 1868 after the Civil War, with the 14th Amendment saying that that the states should not treat people differently under the law. And we will spend a lot more time talking about the 14th Amendment and how important it is in today's world. But also very quickly have to mention the 13th Amendment that did abolish slavery in the country. So that's the constitutional system. That's how all of these pieces fit together. It's not a very long document. In fact, it's remarkably short and long-lived. If we just quickly go to thinking about the amendments, we haven't, like I said before, a very small number of amendments, only 27. And this is a summary. This is all the amendments: the Bill of Rights, state issues, presidential election and succession. You can see there are more amendments about that than about anything else. The Civil War amendments, the right to vote, income tax, Senate elections, and we'll mention prohibition. I haven't mentioned that before. That was the attempt to put a prohibition on alcohol into the Constitution, and then it was taken out with the 21st Amendment, so canceled out. And pay raises for Congress. Those are all the amendments. Now, in the next section, I want to take you to a discussion about how to interpret the Constitution. So that'll be the next video lecture. All right?